My name is Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education here at the Pérez Art Museum, Miami, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the museum today for this lovely program. I would like to thank you for being here for what I am sure is going to be a very warm and insightful conversation between a special group of people. Today's talk features Teresita Fernández, PAMM Director Franklin Sirmans, PAMM Associate Curator María Elena Ortiz, and Seattle Art Museum Director Amada Cruz. The exhibition Elemental presents an unparalleled opportunity to experience over 50 works of art by one of the nation's leading contemporary artists, Teresita Fernández. This exhibition introduces visitors to the artist's expansive conceptual approach to landscape. Through large-scale sculptures, experiential installations, and mixed media works, Fernández brings to light relationships between elemental materials, nature, history, and the cultural, socio-political references tied to the perception of place. Before we begin, I would like to thank the many people and organizations that have made this program and exhibition possible. Teresita Fernández Elemental is co-organized by the Pérez Art Museum Miami and Phoenix Art Museum. This exhibition is presented by Citi with generous support from the Ford Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, the Jorge M. Pérez Family Foundation, and John Hardy Jewelry. Additional support was provided from Funding Arts Network and J.W. Marriott Marquis, Miami. Lead individual support from Camille and Patrick McDowell, together with support from Patricia and William Klee, and Anthony and Celeste Muir, is also gratefully acknowledged. Valuable support for the exhibition catalog was provided by Lehman Maupin, New York and Hong Kong. And closer to home, a very special thank you to the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau and the Art of Black Initiative, which gratefully acknowledges this support under the leadership of Connie Kennard, Petra Brennan, and Rosie Gordon-Wallace. Thank you. Please note that immediately following the panel, Teresita will sign copies of the exhibition catalog in our Vatakuti Learning Theater right below here. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Teresita Fernández, Franklin Sirmans, María Elena Ortiz, and Amada Cruz. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Anita, for coordinating with us. Thank you, Denise, Andrew up there. It is awesome to be here on this occasion and to see you all on this second day of Art Week. And for you to spend this time on this afternoon, we're thankful for that. So thanks for being here. I'm looking forward to this incredible conversation with these panelists. We're just going to talk. I mean, we basically have been talking amongst ourselves for a few years, and this is the opportunity for Teresita to shine, and we are so happy and proud to have this exhibition here and to be able to share it with everybody. Of course, we opened, a month ago, and are now going through a series of programs, and I've already had a couple, and there is more to come. But for this afternoon, I was thinking, while we have the opportunity with curatorial insight, contributors to the book, and Teresita, that we would talk a little bit through maybe the structure of the actual catalog. And I thought it would be interesting just to think through that a little bit with some of the titles to our table of contents. The book, obviously, is something that lives on beyond the exhibition, and I think in many ways is an important counterpart and complement to the exhibition. So we thought it would be a good place to talk about structure and, of course, to touch a little bit upon Teresita's work, but also to get these viewpoints that we have today. And it's so good to see you, Amada. As Marie said, this is a collaboration between the Phoenix Art Museum, and Gilbert Vicario is here, shout out to Gilbert, and also to the Pérez Art Museum Miami, and to work with Amada, who is now the director of the Seattle Art Museum. Congratulations. You were, a month in? 2 months. Bravo, bravo. Welcome back. So let me I'm just going to go through the table of contents because I think it's interesting. So I did the foreword, thus I am in the moderating seat today, and tried to approach the foreword from that point of view. As somebody who has known Teresita and known her work for about 20 years, which is basically the span of the exhibition that we're talking about. And as we touch upon that, I think as we touch upon the practice that has been a part of this exhibition, it is interesting to get these kind of insights. So we started off with the foreword, and we moved into what is effectively a bookend for the entire catalog. And I say that to the first aspect of the book is a conversation with Maria Elena and Teresita, and that first one is stacked landscapes. And we're going to elucidate stacked landscapes. Then we went to Aruna D'Souza, and an essay called Teresita Fernández, Diasporic Landscapes, which also is quite telling. Aruna will actually be here on January 16, I think, with Teresita and Maria Elena. So we're looking forward to that. And then Teresita Fernández and Felix González Térez, Something Personal by Amada. We moved on to a more sort of philosophical space, I think, with The Metaphysics of Space by Saif Rodney, and then also All Manner of Thing Shall Be Alive by Matthew Spellberg. And then the other bookend is a interview or a conversation, a continuum of a conversation, which we decided to make into this conceptual mode of a bookend, and that was a conversation. Artist as Citizen, and that is kind of the sectioning of the book. So as I think through those titles and I think through what they mean within the context of the work, I just want to begin with an entry point, which is, when did you first see Teresita's work? And we'll start with Amada.
I first actually met Teresita before I saw her work, and this is a lesson for all of us to always listen to our artist friends. The introduction was made by Íñigo Manglano Ovalle, you know him, wonderful artist who was based in Chicago, still is, and he called me, this was about 1995 or 6, and he called me, I was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and he said, I was just in Miami, I saw this amazing artist, she's young, she's Cuban-American, and I'm doing a show in Chicago. Can you put her up in your apartment?
Practical.
Very practical. And of course I said yes. And so Teresita actually came and stayed with us in our apartment in Chicago. So I actually had a conversation with her before actually seeing her show. And later on, a few months later, was here in Miami visiting my family. And Teresita and I did a studio visit. So we first saw each other. I think I first saw the work about 1996 or so. And you were working out of your little house. And the work was very different. Sculpture had a little bit of a nautical vibe going, but obviously something quite interesting. And these beautiful watercolors, I think they were, of pork. How many Cubans are in the audience? Pork. So sort of fascinated by that. And actually another artist, Gary Simmons, had told me about Teresita's pork works as well. So we've known each other for a long time.
And Maria Elena?
So I actually learned about Teresita's work through the internet. So when I was actually many, many decades ago in college, I was in Houston, and I would always be interested in what was happening at Art Pace. And I would always look for artists that I could easily pronounce, since my first language is Spanish. And I saw Teresita's name on the website, and I started looking at what her work was then. And of course, I was very captivated by the work that she was doing. So it was more like, I'm from the internet generation.
Indeed. Which gives us, I think, the kind of breadth that is necessary to really look at the work in a holistic way, especially with its reference points, I think, back to the past, as much as it is in the present, which brings us to you, of course, Teresita. What does this exhibition mean to you? This mid-career retrospective, looking back at 20 years?
I'm still on like the pork nautical reference because that has never come out. That's the thing when you have these panels with people who have known you for over 20 years, is like there's some really funny anecdotes. But when you said, I'm gonna answer your question, but when you said that, what I thought, and I remember that little house where I was working in my house, there was no furniture in it. I just had a studio in my house in Miami, in like the suburbs of Miami. But I never thought of that until you said that right now about the nautical reference. My parents, who came, as many people in the city, as Cuban exiles in the late 50s. My father worked in a factory that built yachts for 30 years, laying fiberglass like labor, before he opened his own very successful business on the Miami River, which was a high-end, a company that would service high-end yachts and yacht owners, special requests. And so a lot of the free materials that I would get would come from whatever I could get off the shelves of his nautical business. So I never made that connection, but I just wanted to point that out.
I did.
The pork thing, like I had to think about that a little because I never thought of it as pork, but they were these really, really beautiful like watercolor drawings of meat, of layers, of translucent color, of translucent paper, and they were drawings of meat, which was really weird because I never made that series of work again. Like I never returned to that. But I think at that point there was a kind of exploration of what role the body played in these installations that I was creating, and that was discarded. But I think that's what I was trying to do. Either that or I was just hungry. I don't know. But this show is so significant to me in so many ways, and in many ways I feel like it's the first opportunity that I've had to put a couple of decades, my entire life's work, into a context that could give it a fuller, richer meaning. For the most part, when one part of my work was being looked at or talked about, the other parts were not. And so it was an incredible moment for me to teach people and the audience and viewers and people who may not know my work at all. Like I'm very interested in how very young people might come and discover my work and not ever having known it. But to do so with full agency that speaks about beauty and the conceptual and the art historical and the ancient and the social-political and all of these things in this very holistic way that very actively resists being fetishized for one thing or another.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on a bunch of things, and I think I had like quotes from some of your interviews and past interviews, and touching on all of those elements you just kind of recognized. But how, as far as the exhibition goes, and in relationship to your work, I think it's interesting to think about that pause where we were talking about the interview in particular. And we talked about maybe it should be one flowing interview that kind of took apart these two different conversations. And I think in the end you convinced me that it was actually a much better bookend. And it feels perfectly right. But when you speak to it now, you speak of this, the relationship to beauty, the relationship to politics in a very seamless way. It is a complete synergy. And yet within the book, I think we set it up differently.
Yeah, the book, which to me is a document, it was a document that was very strategically designed from beginning to end to resist erasure. And I knew that the minute that I started to work on it, is that every choice that I would make in relation to this would be to create the document that told the story of my work from the point of view that has been always ignored by the canon that I was taught in art history, or that any young, American art student is taught. And so that was the question that I would ask myself all the time, is like, what writers do I invite? How is this structured? We went back and forth a lot with the more activist part of what I do in my practice. And I don't think of that as separate of my practice because I experience the world holistically. But in the end, we kind of decided that we would excerpt that part of the interview where I'm talking mostly about the conceptual part of the work, and that we would add it almost as this footnote in the back, artist as citizen, like saying, and this too, and this too. A little bit like the difference between being bilingual and bicultural. So if you're bilingual and you've learned one language and another and you kind of translate back and forth because you speak two languages, you're still switching modes. But if you're bicultural and you own two modes of thinking simultaneously, you're actually always thinking in those things all the time. You're not toggling. And so the book was a way of creating something that felt holistic and that was a reflection of what the real practice is like, which is that there isn't a toggling back and forth or a choosing one mode over another, but that both modes inform and create depth in the physical work, in the art historical component of the work, in the personal narrative component of the work.
And in design, the book does not toggle between the two. The book reads horizontally in both languages, which I think is pretty interesting and specific to what you're talking about, and also telling about all of us in our relationship to Mcginty, somebody who we all knew of and knew her practice. We sat in a room together, we talked about different ideas, we looked at different books together, and in the end, working with her to come up with Elemental. So I have to ask, Amada, tell us about your essay and what was the genesis for thinking about your essay?
Again, this goes back to a couple of decades ago. Teresita and I became friends, close friends very early on when we first met. And earlier, I had become very good friends with Felix Gonzalez-Torres and actually organized a survey of his work.
His first museum show. I'm just plugging him.
Thank you. We take care of each other. And so the three of us were having sort of a conversation. I was talking to Felix about Teresita's work. You have to meet this artist. She's so good. She's young. We have to talk to her. You need to really sort of get involved in the dialogue of her work. At the same time, I was talking to Teresita about Felix's work, and he was very important to both of us. And then at one point, we finally figured out a way for Teresita and Felix to meet. And the essay in the book is really sort of thinking about these two artists that have very different practices, but also very similar practices. And it's really about the personal nature of this work. Felix's work, is everyone in the audience knows, looks very cool, very minimal, geometric, but there's a lot of life in that work. There's a lot of intensity, and it's very personal work. And it really coaxes you into thinking about your life and thinking about your relationship to the social. And Teresita's work is very similar in that way as well. As you walk through the show, you'll see, if you just want to get caught up in the beauty of it, which is what you could do also with Felix's work, that's fine. But if you want to work a little harder or think a little bit more, then there's an undercurrent of a lot of other things that are going on in the work. And so the essay was really about placing these two artists together in terms of how they view the world and how the world and the political is in their work. They're sort of like political landscapes. I was thinking about it today going through the show again. There's this idea of the landscape being political, but taking very different forms.
It's such a fascinating thing to think about in relationship also to the exhibition and the fact, we begin with a work from 1996 as you walk into the gallery. Next to that, 1997, and to the right of that, the great piece from Art Pace, 1998. And you mentioned minimalism, and I think I just want to look at that for a second outside of the Felix conversation. If I think about that time, and I think about that time in the mid-90s, there's this sense that you've identified in both Teresita and Felix's work that, yes, we can talk in terms of an art historical position around minimalism, but yet there are all of these ideas that are embedded inside of it now, right? It isn't just solely that formal conversation that one could have, but about looking at something a little bit deeper. I'm just curious how that plays out, within the moment of, say, conception, mid-90s, few people working in this way and thinking about ideas in that way.
I mean, it was so important for me to have Amada write this essay, and I really kind of had to beg for it, I'm just saying. But like, how many of you know, here's Art World audience here, right? How many of you know that Amada curated Felix's first museum show at the Hirshhorn, And it's like, the reason why it was so important for me to have Amada write this essay, and I'm very grateful for it, is precisely because so many of you may not know that fact. And I'm the artist version of that fact, which is that there is no context for people like us, in the art world anyway. And so what I noticed happening after Felix's death, and Felix, of course, was a dear friend of ours, and somebody whose work, and we're going to talk about minimalism because that's important too. Felix was, a brown man. He was an immigrant. He spoke with a thick accent. Miami was the first place where he arrived after going to school in Puerto Rico. He also died here. And since his death, his entire career, his work, his creative practice has been completely whitewashed of those facts. And as somebody growing up, also knowing about Felix as an artist and reading texts about him, I realized that what made him sort of more like us, like the things that we had in common, slowly started to disappear from the way that his work was being represented and talked about. But there were also huge parts of his work that nobody was talking about within that context. And so to have Amada write this essay to me was this really important thing, which is I wanted to talk about minimalism and conceptual art with having it being looked at by somebody who understood who I was. It's not that I wanted somebody to write about me as a Cuban-American artist because Felix was a Cuban-American artist and Amada is Cuban-American. It's not that simplistic. What I wanted is for somebody to talk about the minimal and the conceptual from the point of view that also understood who I was and where I was coming from with intimacy, because there was a lot of sort of little blind spots that didn't get included. And so that is what was important to me. And it's a beautiful essay, and it's the first time, oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly enough, because, there are reasons why these omissions happen. It's the first time that somebody writes an essay about Felix's work and my work in relation to one another, the first time. So it's important.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment because I think that also, Donald Judd, all those guys are never asked to speak about their works from the cultural standpoint, but, Teresita and others are. So I think that's also a big difference, a nuance here, because we could speak about Donald Judd and Solowit from their position in our society, and we could, do that as well.
And then also, to answer your question, then, okay, so then let's talk about that minimalism and let's talk about that conceptualism, right? Because that's what we're making space for. And it's really important to understand, and I believe that this is the connection that I have with Felix's work, is that it's a foil, It is, all of those things are a veneer. It's the thing that draws you in, that makes you stay longer, because the work is about so many other things that refuse to be spoken about as stereotypes or within some kind of Baroque language. And so there's a kind of push and pull that's really important. And in many ways, the most minimal gesture is the most loaded one sometimes,
And Maria Elena, thinking about that through your conversations with Teresita, obviously from a different generational vantage point, how do you make that consideration? I know for me, and thinking about that moment, and you mentioned the first Felix show, first Gary Simmons show. I mean, some people were talking about the work similarly in that moment. How does your historical distance read those moments?
Well, I see it more as a historical proximity because right now, I think, and this is where, and I also want to put on the record, for me, working in this exhibition, talking to Teresita and exchanging ideas, not only about art, but just about our current moment is one of the most enriching parts of this process. And for me, that was the biggest entry point. You know, something that we talked about significantly is this whole idea of Latinx and Latinx culture, and how kind of pushing the boundary of how can America come to terms with its Latinness, and which is very much part of your most recent body of work, Fire. So for me, that was a very easy way to just as an entry point and as a connection, and also I would also say from a gender standpoint, you know, seeing strong females, not only Teresita but also Amada, who are paving the way. It's very important, and it's very inspirational, enriching, and so on. And I do think that I would also want to add that, you know, you mentioned beauty. Yeah, some people think, oh, the work is so beautiful. And I remember saying, no, but to some colleagues, but it's also very political. There's something very poignant about pointing to the fragility of a minimalist sculpture, you know? And then when you think about her standpoint and so on, it becomes very, you know, very significant.
Teresita, curious, you mentioned the materials of a point very early on, before anybody was talking about your work in this kind of way. Just tell us a little bit about how materials play out in your work, because it's so immensely important. And the thing is, you know, we're here with the exhibition. People get to have this one-on-one experience, which it really and truly demands. It is one thing to see it in reproduction, but it's another thing to be in that space. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, and back to also what you asked about Mcginty, who's the designer for most books that you see, right? But who's a wonderful designer who's done 2 books already for me. When she first, and her studio is 2 blocks away from my studio. So when we first met, and it was very early on, and it was very abstract what the show or what any of it was going to be, I put in front of her a piece of charcoal, a big piece of pyrite, a piece of iron ore, a piece of glass, and I said, I want the book to feel like this. And she was like, got it. And I told her, I want the book to not exclude all the political stuff. And she's like, got it, I've got an idea, you know? So there was a kind of, it's what I refer to as a kind of material intelligence. And what that means is, in all the works, is that the choice of the material in each piece is very deliberate and it's conceptual. The material is both the thing itself, say charcoal, and the thing that it's describing, a landscape. So the charcoal is a burned tree. The iron ore is something that's dug out from underground in a room that's referring to subterranean spaces. That green room with the malachite is literally taking the material, which is this malachite rock from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and using it to just make this abstract landscape of Viñales Valley in Cuba, which is a real landscape that looks just like that malachite rock, oddly enough, this very kind of surreal landscape, and which is a landscape that in real life, if you go to it, is full of this quite extensive cave system, which is where indigenous people would make their homes and before colonization, but it was also where enslaved individuals from surrounding plantations in the area would find refuge when they'd run away from plantations. And this is important. You know, we often forget what Miami is. Miami is Florida. Florida used to be Spain. You know, when you look at like the New York Times article of 1619, the New York Times piece 1619 on slavery. So in the Caribbean, slavery starts 100 years before. Havana just celebrated its 100th birthday, 1519, and there was slavery. So you know, these hidden narratives are really important. Slavery was abolished in Cuba 2 decades after it was in what we now call the United States. And everything sort of happens first and 100 years before in the Caribbean, as we know. And so these were really important things that I was uncovering conceptually through the material. And it's really important that I'm talking about the specificity of that Cuban landscape through this very real rock, which was extracted and mined from a place in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's what I mean when I say stacked landscapes. It's this idea of being in more than one place simultaneously. And the fact of the material, the intelligence of the material itself is the vehicle, the glue that holds it all together. And this notion that materials already come, like viewers, in fact, like individual viewers, already come loaded with their own information that is quite real and palpable and historical and cultural, so that it's not just an artist making things up.
Yeah, it reminds me of, obviously, I mean, thinking of stacked landscapes, thinking about stacks, thinking about the conversation that you were having in the book. Amada, if you could tease out a little bit more around that idea in particular and how it relates to stacked landscapes, this history.
Stacked landscapes. Well, because we've been talking, I was talking about Felix. I think about Felix's, right? Stacks right away. Is this where you're going, Franklin?
Totally.
Yes. So those of you who may not be familiar with Felix's stacks, they're actually unlimited prints. And the prints would be made, identical prints, and they would all be literally stacked. So they would look like a cube. They would look like a minimalist sculpture. And if you would encounter one in the middle of a gallery, you might think it was just a solid piece of something, some kind of material. But you can actually take one of those pieces from the stacks. And there's an ideal height for a stack. Sometimes it was the weight of somebody. And the institution or the owner would have to constantly replenish that stack to be the ideal height. So there's an idea of depletion. Something being constantly depleted, but also constantly being replenished as well. So obviously a metaphor for the body and all of that. Really powerful work. And Teresita also makes stacked landscapes. So that's what I was referring a little bit before to this idea of a landscape being political. And I mean, Teresita's the best person to talk about this, obviously, but the stacked landscapes, or the idea of a stacked landscape, is that a landscape isn't just one thing. It's not just about the green of the leaves, let's say, or the brown of the soil, but it actually is the political, the social, the history. It's not just the geologic, and what does it actually mean to have this landscape? And so I think there's so much of that in the work. There are a lot. In a way, the whole show could be a stacked landscape.
And as Maria Elena, as you pointed out, these things could be read, aesthetics could be read into those other past works. I mean, you mentioned Judd, for instance, but they're not in many ways, right? It comes down to a certain mind frame, and I think from your conversation with Teresita, I mean, obviously there's a different kind of set of ideas that she's thinking of within the work.
Definitely, and I think this is where Ana Mendieta, like looking at Ana Mendieta and her work, becomes very central, or as a really good clue of how to enter the work. And I think now, after the show being realized, I look at Ana Mendieta's photographs and the landscape in those photographs, the body in that photograph, but also the earthliness on that photo, on those works, and then think about the elements, the rocks, the landscapes, the waters, and I see a lot of that in your work. Like I see this investigation that very much alludes to not only Felix but also Ana Mendieta and those histories.
That's an amazing thing to think about. I mean, this relationship between the work and a sort of bodily experience. You often talk about the landscape and these kind of not empty landscapes, but stand-ins for perhaps the viewer. And in some places, you put us inside of the work.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought up Ana Mendieta, because we all think we know Ana Mendieta, but Ana Mendieta never had a museum show in her life. Most of what we know about Ana Mendieta has been secondhand interpreted by people after her death. And I thought again about this every time I did work on this catalog, which is that I had an enormous responsibility and privilege to get my story straight and to not hold back on all the layers of the work. Because if you don't do it, somebody else will do it for you. And this is what I kept seeing over and over again, is that whether it was somebody like Carmen Herrera, who is basically 105 and wheelchair bound, so she doesn't participate in these conversations about her newly discovered work that has this amazing market around it, that has amazing context around it, right? Or somebody like Anna, who pretty much it's a story that's told without her present, which is the ultimate act of erasure. Or Cecilia Vicuña, who just walked in, who is, it's such an incredible honor to be able to be alive at the same time as Cecilia Vicuña, and to know that her work was discovered late in life, but that she is alive and well to make sure that the narrative that is formed around her and the work is done exactly right. And so these are great acts of resistance. They're acts of not disappearing, and they're really important, because we often think of erasure is something that happened a long time ago, but it's happening all the time, sometimes in really insidious ways institutionally. This particular institution is a really special place. It's not just that this is my hometown and I'm coming back here, right? But it's like there are things happening in Miami and at PAMM which are happening naturally and organically in a way that's not happening at other institutions that are sort of claiming to be at the forefront of it. And it's important to grasp these things and call them that in the moment. As we know, I mean, there are just this panel up here is very rare in our world. Amada is one of the few Latina museum directors in this country. María Elena is one of a handful of Afro-Latina curators anywhere. Franklin is one of the few Black museum directors, and I feel like I am the artist version of that as well. And like, yes, we're fancy and we're in the art world and we're doing our thing and we're all successful. That is all true. But we are also constantly negotiating these gestures of erasure and the remnants, what has been left of them, constantly fighting against getting our story straight and speaking with full agency. So I'm so happy that you mentioned Ana Mendieta, because I wonder what my career would have been like if I had known about Cecilia Vicuña's work when I was a student, instead of learning about Donald Judd, or if I could be on stage with Ana Mendieta, who would have been, 15 years older than me, having a intergenerational conversation. And so we don't have those things. So we're trying to make those things.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't think about some of the conversations that we had around our institutions, and thinking about, the spaces that we work from in terms of geography, in terms of demographics. Can you comment to that a little bit from the Phoenix point of view, even though you're in Seattle?
So Teresita and I started talking about doing a show in Phoenix shortly after I got there, so 4 years ago now. And it became very clear right away that we had to have the show here in Miami, in Teresita's hometown, my second home, and of course our friend Franklin was here, so that made it even more attractive to us. And so Franklin and I had a conversation about, the importance of having the show here, the Caribbean aspect, all of that, the Miami-ness of Teresita's work, which we can now talk about a little bit, and perhaps didn't want to talk about it too much a while ago. But the idea of having her work in these two spaces that are they're very Latinx spaces, right? So Phoenix's population is 41% Latinx, and Miami, I don't even know what it is in Miami.
I can tell
102%. I don't know. I don't know. Does anyone speaking? I don't know.
It's like 80. It's like 80%. Okay.
So anyway, it became obvious to us that this show had to be in these two cities, and it's perfect actually. The conversation around the work is very particular in both places.
Yeah, no, I want to get to questions, but I also want to ask you something. In 2016, and it goes towards where we are right now, the conversation, you did a talk on Robert Smithson at DIA, Center for the Arts, and it sums up a lot of what we're talking about, in terms of the ways that we look at and navigate art through the lens of art history, through the lens of biography, if you will. But you said neutrality is no longer an option. And please expound on it a little bit with those two bookends of the book in mind.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So that lecture that I gave on Smithson at DIA is actually being published into a book by DIA, on a book on Smithson that they're doing. And it starts with a quote of Smithson's, which of course any artist of my generation is sort of influenced by Smithson because that's what we got. And also because he was a great artist, but it's neither one or the other, it's because it's both. And the talk started, it was right after Donald Trump got elected that I gave this talk. And it was basically me trying to come to terms with all of the things that I had been fed as an art student, so that I could point out that it isn't just that here was somebody with a different biographical narrative responding to Smithson and coming up with like a new product, like as though it was like some formula that you could just mix and match and get a different thing. It was about me actually exposing all the things that were wrong about Smithson's kind of authority and dominance in what we call land art or what we call conceptual art. And so the talk starts, and the essay now starts with a quote of Smithson's, which is, history is, I'm paraphrasing, but history is ultimately based on rather flimsy biographical information, something like that. And I basically go through and talk about how so many of Smithson's influences were actually indigenous influences, Mesoamerican influences. So it's the other way around. It's not that he was influencing people, it's that he was being influenced. There was like, you know, Jorge Luis Borges on his bookshelf. And then it was also about discovering for myself this fact as somebody who makes what I think of as a kind of land art, because I'm using material from the land, even though it's not a sculpture in the land. I'm using material that's extracted from the land to talk about landscape in conceptual ways, so there are a lot of sort of overlaps. It was about my own discovery and realizing that most of what we, as people in the art world who are educated, who talk about land art, most of what we know as land art exists on land that is indigenous land, that was, you know, basically where in the 1800s was Mexico, you know, and up until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, these were territories that belonged to Mexico, and it was only through the Forest Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that it became the United States. And so here we are thinking of American art in the American landscape and land art on stolen land, literally, like Mexican landowners being like having land taken from them at gunpoint, which I actually wrote about. It's in an article that I believe comes out today in the New York Times about that exact anecdote. But it was really like, you know, I should say something else too in relation to what you asked about Smithson, but in relation to the show too, having the subtext, is that there are many, many moments in the work and in the show and in my practice that are full of beauty and reflection and a kind of trying to teach the viewer to feel compassion and to feel outside of themselves, to just get outside of themselves. But there are also many moments that are moments of rage that have to do with silence, with having like the wool pulled over your eyes, with having been the product of an art school education that, you know, conditioned many of us to think that this is the story, right? Without ever having our own power to kind of undo those stories. And so it was like a kind of, I don't know, it's like this funny love letter to Smithson where I'm kind of like loving him and hating him at the same time, but also trying to see this iconic quote, American artwork through my own lens, through my own history. And it looks really different when you start to take it apart in that way. So, yeah.
Speaking of, I mean, the final room, I mean, we were just talking about the beauty of the installation. I mean, the final room is this series of works with, at its center, a piece from 2005 that happens to dovetail perfectly with a body of work that you've made in the last few years, and a map, right, of our quote-unquote America. What a fitting coda, if I do say so myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, we are here in lovely Art Basel Week in Miami, eating good things and looking nice. And you know, there are little kids being put in cages and families being separated. And this is like when you think of like, what were people doing during the Holocaust? What were people doing while they were in internment camps? It's like they were hanging out at Basel, just kind of like we are. But the piece in the last piece, the final installation, which has the big charcoal map of the United States, which I made, I actually made the first version of that in 2017. And it was basically dividing up all these states in the continental United States to show the sort of irrationality of their geometric shape that completely ignores the natural formations in the land. And then what I did in this version, if you walk into the installation, is that I took the shape of Mexico, which is always represented in maps as this tiny little thing. Mexico is actually huge. Like what we call Mexico now was bigger, is actually huge. It's like it's much bigger than like Alaska. Alaska is always like shown as this really big thing. And of course, the maps we look at are shaped by those cultural biases, which are not based on actual land mass. And so what I did in the installation is I took the shape of Mexico and I enlarged it super, super big, so big that it was bigger than the United States. And I kind of put it next to the United States, and I made it so big that in the piece, it actually starts turning into the cosmos. So you'll see that the little charcoal pieces that form the shape of Mexico start to sort of diffuse and diffuse until they just look like a constellation of stars, like making it sort of that big. And then all around is a kind of horizon line, which ties all of the fire images in the show. And that is at the same height all around you as a viewer. So it's like it's the foundation. It's the thing that doesn't move or change in a room full of things that are burning and going up in smoke and falling, and going up in like ashes coming apart. The horizon line is meant to ground you. It's also meant to surround you and remind you. So it's like there's no frontal way. You can't get away from it. If you're looking at one, it's behind your head. Two, if you turn around, it's behind you. And you are engulfed by it. But on that horizon line are these forms made out of charcoal that also look like they're burning. And I installed it in a particular way here. They have a very sort of archipelagic quality here. So they almost look like an archipelago of islands also going up in flames. And so there are a lot of little gestures in the show that, maybe only I know of in the way that it was installed. They had to do with just like the proximity to being this close to the water's edge and this close to the Caribbean, which is a kind of quality that I grew up with, that we all grew up with here. My parents kind of arrived to this Jim Crow South that, was so close to the Caribbean. It was almost like this very, very sort of unstable, very dreamlike space that was almost like an island in and of itself. And so I made some of those aesthetic choices and formal choices in the way that particular room is installed that have to do with that, not just the physical land masses of little islands referring to the Caribbean, but rather the archipelagic thought that comes from thinkers like Derek Walcott or Glissant, which are outside of the canon that we are taught as a kind of as American art students or American art history. So there's lots of little sort of nods to those kinds of that kind of subtext throughout the show.
Seems like a perfect place to stop. Shall we have some questions? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take questions from the audience. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you for the lovely conversation. I want to ask a question about process. When I take people through the exhibition, they are floored by the large mosaics, and they want to know, how does she do that? Could you tell us a little bit about the process of creating fire and viñales, please?
I can give you, so process questions are my least favorite. I'm gonna be transparent here. How can I answer this? So my work is really low tech. I mean, it's kind of, I work with a lot of people who are really good at what they do, like a great carpenter or a great metal person or a great, there's a piece outside. I couldn't have done it without engineers. And so I work with people who are experts in their fields that can help me realize certain things. But I personally would rather not get into, like, first I do this, then I do that, in part because it kind of breaks the very fragile magic of how it is that something exists. And I'm much more interested in you as a viewer trying to imagine how it is that that is made. I'm not saying that to be evasive of your question or stuck up. I'm saying it because that sort of suspension of what is this sort of willingness on the part of the viewer to surrender to a kind of imagining is a key component. It's actually at the crux, it's the key component to how I create these installations and why they feel that way. So going step by step and telling you, first you take the glaze, then you do this, then you cut it, it's not that interesting. It's really just, it's a lot of labor, it's a lot of, it's a big team of people cutting things and doing things, and it takes a long time, and it's slow. But other than that, I'm whatever you're imagining of how it's made is so much more interesting. Yeah.
Minimalism, it's somehow kind of like a very macho, white American, and you guys were talking about Ana Mendieta, and we all know the story about Carl Andre, and is your work a straight arrow towards a reaction of what happened with minimalism? Like, do you see your work like a straight reaction for that?
No.
Who buys your work? I mean, you need huge spaces to show it, right? I've seen one at Rosa de la Cruz's house, but I've never seen any other in any other private home or anything. Who actually has the space and the resources to have these huge things or these very special things?
Yeah, I would say that the way that the show is installed here is really trying to make a monumental statement. There are many smaller works. Actually, there's a room full of drawings, and I love working really large scale, and I love working really, really tiny. I'm not so good with medium. I kind of get bored with medium, but I love really huge and really small. So there are many pieces out in the world that are not as huge as some of the huge installations here.
Okay, I have a question, Teresita. We talked a lot about concepts, about history, about correcting history, about landscape, but there is one word or description which didn't come up, and I wonder how you negotiate with it. And it is emotional, because your work is also very emotional. It's very emotional to us all, and it must be very emotional for you to stand in front of your work, particularly here in the museum. How do you negotiate when you create your work between everything you are, everything which is genius about you, and the emotional?
Thank you for asking that. So, when I remember being in graduate school, and that was the bad word, right? You couldn't talk about. Everything was very formal, right? Because when you come out of that tradition, when you got Donald Judd as a reference point, right? The emotional must be the opposite of that, therefore it must be bad. But I mean, yeah, so the reaction that I most value in a work of art, in the viewers when looking at a work of art, is intimacy. And intimacy is always emotional, right? And so we, especially as women artists, like, we don't, that often gets used against us, right? The idea that an artwork is emotional as the opposite of something, because that's not true. The truth is that all things are emotional. That's just a basic kind of intelligence. Kind of like when I talk about the material intelligence. For me, emotional intelligence is just like probably the most effective tool that we have for negotiating, space, life, social situations, but also sort of like our own internal dialogues. And so it is also very hard to make somebody feel something emotional that they would call or experience as emotional. We're bombarded with so many images. We have so many choices. To actually feel moved by something, I think is the greatest luxury of all. That and privacy are like the two greatest luxuries, the thing that becomes farther and farther and less accessible to us every day. And so to me, it's such a great compliment that you asked that as a question, but also that to know that what I'm striving for is very focused on the reward of the privilege to feel something. If you think of the word ecstasy means to be outside of yourself. It's a kind of like having to step outside of yourself in order to feel something, in order to sort of like have that out-of-body experience. And it's something that's really hard to do. It's really hard to take a big piece of metal or a big piece of wood and put it in front of somebody and have them feel. It's easier sometimes with painting, with image making, flat images that are like related to dreams, or they have a kind of like image quality to them. But it's very hard to do that in sculpture and with 3 dimensions, because we experience objects in the world much like we do other people or other things, in a kind of bodily way. So I don't know how I do that, but it's the most important part of what I do, and I have no idea how I do it. Sometimes I think that I do it by doing it myself, so I have to kind of feel some of that in order for it to be transferred to the viewer as an experience, but I have no clue how I do it. Every time I'm in the studio, I'm like, oh, I gotta do this again. I have no idea. It's a very blind process, but it's such an important aspect of grounding you in the world as a viewer, as someone experiencing the world.
I think that's a lovely point to close today's conversation. If there's any other words you'd like to share with us? If not, thank you all for coming here today.
Thank you all.